Well, I first want to say welcome to everybody joining us by video at our campuses and also those that are online joining us by video. I'm so happy to be with you today. Are you ready for some good news? Yes. People aren't always what they seem. Sometimes they're a lot better. We're in a new series. It's called You'll See. And it is an invitation to a new spiritual discipline, a little simple prayer all throughout your day, to just pause and say, Jesus, how do you see this? How do you see this situation? How do you see these people? How do you see this person? And I'm finding the more I pray it, the more I become sensitive to the promptings of the Spirit to really have Jesus' eyes. And we come today to a story that is just laden with many powerful implications for us. You could preach 100 sermons from this. In John chapter 4, it's a story about Jesus in a very unlikely way winding up in a conversation with a Samaritan woman. As I'll explain, the Samaritans were despised by the Jews, and generally men didn't speak to women in public. And here is Jesus in his human nature, tired and thirsty, and at midday he meets her at a well and asks her for a drink. And what follows is a discussion about what Jesus has to offer her, the living water. But I want to center our attention, and we're going to be looking at a number of the different places in this text in John chapter 4, but I want to center our attention into Jesus' invitation to the disciples to look and see as he sees. I'm going to pick up reading at verse 31. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? They're just thinking on the natural level, you see. Jesus is talking about something much deeper than that. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? And here's the point of emphasis. Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that sower and reaper may rejoice together. Look, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. When he said that, literally, as we'll see, there were Samaritans from the nearby village that were making their way to come out and meet Jesus. And he wanted them to be able to see what was at hand, all of these lives that were about to be transformed. Well, it's probably one of the most famous optical illusions of a picture that was on a postcard, a German postcard in 1915, and the artist called it My Wife and My Mother-in-Law. And some people look at the picture and they see an old woman, and others look at the picture and see a young woman. Which one do you see? See if you can see both. Okay, if you're having trouble, let me put up some help for you. The young lady's face is turned as if she's looking over her right shoulder with a delicate chin and a slight nose. But the old woman's face has a large nose and a big chin. So in other words, the young lady's here, and what looks like a mouth on this woman is actually a necklace here, and on the old woman, the nose and the chin. Now, put it back to the original image, and let me see, can you see both of them? What's interesting is that people have studied this optical illusion, and they have discovered a couple of things. Number one, the younger you are, the more likely you are to see the young woman. The older you are, the more likely to see the old woman. It's very interesting. Studies have shown that. The other thing is very interesting and not surprising is that if I had shown you a picture of a young woman somewhat similar to that before you looked at this, you would have been much more likely to see the young woman. If our brain can end up focusing in one direction or another on some simple drawing like this, how much more so in real life? When you see somebody, what do you see? And I want to talk to you today about how, in so many ways, in our natural abilities, we are not very good at really seeing someone for who they really can be. We are not very good in Malcolm Gladwell's words of his newest book. We're not very good at talking to strangers. And yet Jesus was perfect. And this is a story that is about how Jesus saw this woman, and it's a story about how she was changed, and it's a story about how a whole village was changed. And so it's really important that when you meet someone, or someone that you already know in your life, that you have the capacity to see more and more as Jesus does. It makes so much difference. Well, this is the thing you never want to hear your preacher say, I have a confession. It's not bad. It's not bad. Don't worry about it. You never want to hear that in a sermon, I have a confession. But I do have a confession. I got pulled the other night for, I didn't know why. I had just pulled out of a restaurant on busy Louisville Clemens Road to take a left. It's hard to take a left. You got to really scoot out of there. And I scooted out of there and was just on my way home. And all of a sudden, the blue light's behind me, and I thought, what have I done? I mean, of course, your mind starts going. I haven't even been out here. How could I be speeding? I just pulled out here. And did I pull out too quick? What have I done? And so the officer comes to the window, and I smiled at him, and I said, good evening, officer. And he said, good evening, and he smiled back at me, and he was real nice. He said, reason I pulled you over is I noticed that your registration sticker is out of date. I said, you're kidding. A look of shock on my face. I said, I had no idea. He said, I figured you didn't even know. I said, I got grown kids and a wife and stuff. I got too many cars everywhere. I'm always on everybody about getting their registration up to date. I can't believe it happened to me. He looked at me. He said, I got kids too and got cars. He said, let me just see your driver's license, please. And I thought, wow, boy, he's so nice. And he went back to his car, and he was back there for a long time. A long time. I thought, oh man, he's found 5 other violations. What is it going to be when he finally comes back up here? And he came back up and was nice as he could be. And he said, yeah, you had your car. You need to get your car inspected, and you need to get this thing. He said, this is just a warning tonight. He said, but go ahead and get that done. I said, yes, sir, will. I said, thank you. You've been very, very kind. And I don't know if it helped. That as he was looking up my car registration, that my license plate reads, grace to you. But anyway, I got some. And, okay, so what happened in that scene was if he had given me a ticket for that, I would have deserved it, and I wouldn't have been upset at all. I really actually, the man was nice as could be. I wasn't nervous. I knew I couldn't have done anything real bad. I just pulled out of a thing. But I was also eager to be kind to him. He was very, very kind officer. He was just helpful and doing his job, and I appreciate it. So we had a very pleasant encounter. Doesn't always go that way. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Talking to Strangers, recounts the painful story of Sandra Bland, who was 28 years old, African-American woman, who had just moved from Chicago to Texas to take a new job at Prairie View University. She was driving a silver Hyundai with Illinois plates. She had only been in Texas for a day, and a state trooper pulled her over, and she looked nervous to him. And he said, you seem nervous. Are you okay? And she said, yeah, I am agitated. She said, I am mad because the officer said, I pulled you over because you failed to signal to change lanes. And she said, "I'm really mad. You pulled me over for failing to signal when I changed lanes." What had actually happened was she was driving in the left lane. The officer pulled up on her really quickly, and she wanted to get out of his way, so she pulled over the right-hand lane, and then he pulled her over for not signaling when she got over the right-hand lane. The whole discussion became more and more agitated. She was smoking a cigarette, and he said, "Would you put that cigarette out?" And she said, "You don't have any right to tell me to put the cigarette out." And it got at that point where the officer got a bit emotional about the whole thing. And it escalated until he said, "Ma'am, I need you to get out of the car." And she said, "I haven't done anything except you said I didn't signal." And it became very heated. All of it was recorded on her phone. And in this very painful altercation, she's taken out of the car. He has to physically get his hands on her. Another officer comes, they put her in handcuffs, and they take her because she had been lashing out, and now they take her for felony assault and take her to jail. And it turns out that Sandra had been really troubled over the last year. She'd been through a lot, and she'd had several suicide attempts. She had scars on one of her arms. She was in a very fragile place. She had some history of psychiatric help. Of course, the police officer didn't know all of that. And she was in her jail cell, and on the third day, she contrived a way to take her own life. I just think about how different something that, in many ways, my offense of not having a car registration up to date was more severe than what she did. But in the interaction, there was so much misunderstanding between that officer and Sandra Bland, and so many mistakes that officer made, and she was being rude. And all of this, it took place to where it wound up in such a tragic end. That sometimes we think that we know what's going on with somebody, and we don't know what's going on with somebody. And we're just not very good at this. When I was pulled over, it was a lot easier because, honestly, this police officer, he's probably about my age. He had the same color skin I have. Sounded like he was from North Carolina. He saw I was from North Carolina. We both dads of grown kids. We could talk about things. It was a little bit easier, right? But sometimes when somebody's really different than you, that's where we don't do a very good job. And we come to a story that is absolutely astonishing because you couldn't draw up a story in that time and place of a more unlikely conversation or a more unlikely positive result from a conversation than that which Jesus had with this Samaritan woman. Jews did not associate with Samaritans. They were considered a mixed breed. Without going into all the history, what happens, the Assyrians invaded into the northern kingdom in 722 BC. And a lot of the people, a lot of the Jews that had lived there, those Hebrew people, their culture got mixed in with other peoples, and they were just considered by the faithful Jews as the ones who had not held to their purity. And so they really were looked down upon by all the Jews, and the Samaritans, the Jews just didn't have anything to do with one another. It was so strong that according to some of the Jewish writings, Samaritans were considered unclean and were in a perpetual state of being what you call ceremonially unclean, meaning if you associate with them, then you also are unclean and therefore disqualified from certain ceremonies at the temple. There was a lot of backlash from the Samaritans for all the hatreds that the Jewish people gave to them. So the Samaritans declared their own Bible of just the first 5 books of the Bible, and they declared their own place of worship on a different place than Jerusalem at Gerizim. And in 128, there was actual violence in which the Hasmoneans came in and destroyed the Samaritan temple. It was so strong that often on the route from Judea and Jerusalem area up to the northern area in Galilee, oftentimes Jewish people would just take a different route around them. The most direct way is to go right through Samaria, but oftentimes they would go around it just so they wouldn't have to encounter Samaritans. And Jesus, with his disciples, goes straight through Samaria, and where he meets her at a well, and she's a Samaritan. The second thing to say that makes this such an unlikely conversation to even happen is that in that day and time, Jewish men did not speak to a woman in public. In fact, the strictest of the Jewish men did not speak to their own wife in public. It was considered a complete violation of social protocol. There's something funny. There was some of the strictest Pharisees were called the bleeding and bruised Pharisees because in their intent to never look at a woman in public, if a woman was approaching, they would close their eyes and run into walls and trees and things. So they called them the bleeding and bruised Pharisees. She was a Samaritan. She was a woman, and she was of a group of people that the religious leaders and the teachers, as Jesus was emerging as this very popular new rabbi, looked down upon because she was one of what they called the people of the land, meaning people that worked with their hands, people, the fisherman as a shepherd, and she was married to people like that, that they just thought, these aren't the people you would talk to about the finer points of theology. Add to that, she was divorced, as you could see in the text. We didn't read it, but you see, she said she'd been divorced for 5 times. We learned that she was living with someone that wasn't her husband. If you want to get an idea of just how she felt, the text reveals that she came in the middle of the day to get water. And nobody came in the middle of the day. Women, it was their role to get the water, but they would come in the morning, or they'd come in the evening at dusk when it was cool. But nobody came out in the heat of the day. Why did she come in the middle of the day? The speculation for most commentators is that she was too ashamed. She didn't want to be there and hear the gossip and be seen by people. She was a woman that was full of shame. The Jewish people had a commitment to purity, which meant that they believed they should limit all interactions with Gentiles and especially with Samaritans. And so here's a woman who is a Samaritan woman who has a very checkered past, and it's just astonishing that this conversation ever happened. But it did. And what a conversation ensued. I wish we had time to read the whole chapter, but let me make sure I give you the highlights of it. You might follow along if you have your Bible, but it just to give you the highlights of it, he comes and he says to her at verse 7, give me a drink. She is therefore engaged with him, but she says to him at verse 9, the Samaritan woman said, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And at verse 10, Jesus said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And thus ensued Jesus speaking on spiritual terms and she speaking in physical terms about water, but Jesus leads her into a conversation until finally at verse 13 he says, everyone who drinks of the water that he speaks of will be, the water at the well be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give will never be thirsty again. The water that I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And she said, sir, give me this water. Engaged in a spiritual conversation with her. You know, the first thing I learned from this story is you never know. That's the favorite saying of Mr. Mack. He was our resident patriarch, custodian, elder, servant. Every time the door was open at the church I served, my first church I ever served, a little church in Durham, Mr. Mack was there. And his favorite saying was, you never know. Ann and I still say that to each other today. We'll just, if something surprises us, we say, well, you never know. I never know, Mr. Mack. He said that every time that I would say him. He would say, you never know. Well, you never know. It's just so interesting. You think you know somebody and you don't know them. You know, one of the great privileges that I get, one of the most holy privileges, is to visit with bereaved families and plan memorial services. And I like to sit down and talk to them. And oftentimes I've known the deceased and maybe pretty well because I've been pastoring here for a long time. But I want to hear their stories. I want to hear them talk about their loved one. And it's such a privilege because I get to hear all these things that I never would have known, because you just know somebody from one little angle, don't you? One of our matriarchs, Carolyn Purcell, went home to be with the Lord this week. She's 92. She was a beautiful woman. She was a very, 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 very special woman. She loved the Lord, and she had a fervor for telling people about Jesus. She was always on mission, even in her last days. When she's in assisted living and receiving care, she's caring about others. She's special. But I got to sit down and talk with her daughters, and I found out that she loved Alabama football. She watched Alabama football every Saturday. Who'd have thought? You never know. My grandfather dropped out of school when he was in 6th grade, and he started selling men's clothing at the train depot in Greensboro, and eventually he started a store, and I think in his heyday he had 5 stores. And I loved my grandfather. I worked at Wright's clothing store most years in the summertime and at Christmas. And my grandfather, he had a little salty language. If the salesmen weren't doing anything and he came down, he'd be a little salty in his language. You know, I don't pay you to them sitting around playing, you know. And they learn. They'll jump up, start polishing the table, even if there wasn't a customer in the store. They'd do something. If Granddaddy was coming down, Mr. Wright's coming down, they'd say. And I worried about my grandfather a little bit because he didn't go to church much. He was a member at First Lutheran Church in Greensboro, but he played golf most of the time on Sunday, and I didn't really ever hear him talk much about things of the Lord at all, and I worried about him, you know, and we're about him spiritually, and I worried about those salesmen sometimes, you know, but they all stayed. They stayed there. They had such longevity and all that. At my grandfather's funeral, Pastor Sam, who'd been the Lutheran pastor, that long since retired. He was old by this time. He was there to talk about my grandfather, and I talked to him after the service as well. And he said, "Oh, I tell you, I loved your grandfather." They played golf together, the pastor, not on Sunday morning, but they played golf together. And he looked at me, Pastor Sam said, he said, "You know, I never bought a suit of clothes my whole life." He said, "I never bought a stitch of men's clothing. Your grandfather gave me everything I ever wore." He started telling me stories. Some of those salesmen were there, and they coming up started telling me stories about when they went through a hard time and my grandfather had taken care of them and helped them financially, and stories, you know. You think sometimes you know somebody, you don't know them. The day before my wedding, Ann's Uncle Stanley had flown in from California to officiate, and we'd had our premarital counseling with someone else, but Stanley met with us for an hour or two, and one of the things he said was, "I just encourage you to never say, no matter how many years you're married, don't say, 'I know the other like the back of my hand.'" He said, you really don't. He said, "You know, you each have a whole lifetime that you've lived. You could spend your whole lifetime and you'd never be able to share everything that you have experienced, but you're going to be experiencing life together and in individual paths as well, and you'll be surprised." And I adopted that. I thought, don't ever think, "Oh, I know you." You know, that's either for good or for bad. You never know. My wife, she told me in recent years that she has a dream of going dog sledding in Alaska or Yellowstone. I said, "Dog sledding? What? Will my real wife come back in here?" My wife, you know my wife. Can you just see her? Mush. I mean, I'm just like, who is she? You know, you never really know. And I want to just say that there is, in a sense, a bliss of knowing how little you know. Malcolm Gladwell, in the preface to his book, Talking to Strangers, has an interesting little story. He said that some years ago, his parents came to visit him in New York. And he said his parents were people that did not watch TV, didn't listen to popular things, didn't read popular magazines. He said, my father knew really three things, a Bible and math and gardening. And Gladwell said for fun, he put him up in one of the ritziest hotels in New York where all the famous people go and stay. And after the first afternoon that evening, Malcolm came and he saw his dad. He said, "You have a good day?" His dad said, "Yes." And Malcolm said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "Well, I sat in the lobby a good bit, and I met a stranger. I talked to him." And Malcolm Gladwell said, "Well, what'd you talk about?" He said, "Gardening." He said, "Man, love gardening." He said, "We had a most delightful conversation." And Malcolm Gladwell said, "Well, what was his name?" He said, "I never found out." He said, "But what was most interesting," he said, "people kept coming up and wanting to stand next to him and have their picture made with him. And they kept bringing a little piece of paper and wanted him to sign his name." And so Malcolm Gladwell visited. He'd been with some famous celebrity the entire afternoon and didn't know it and didn't care. And they just talked about gardening. And they never have found out who the celebrity was. And can't you just envision the scene? It might have been the happiest time that celebrity had in a long time, that somebody didn't know who he was. They could just talk to him about something like gardening. There's something that can be blissful about realizing, you don't know everything about everyone. And I think that's the beginning point. I heard a pastor and teacher and author, John Maxwell, who teaches a lot about leadership. I heard him many years ago say something that stuck with me. He said when he would travel and he would preach in churches as a guest preacher, and his custom was always give an invitation where people come forward and accept Christ. And he said, I always would ask the senior pastor at the local church, when I give the invitation, how many people do you think are going to come forward? And he said, always, he said, the number that I had in mind, that Maxwell had in mind of how many people were going to come forward, was always at least twice, if not 5 times, what the local senior pastor. And it just really registered with me. And I found it very interesting that we've done conferences all over the nation about the healing of shame. And they're not evangelistic conferences, they're about the healing of the soul. And I'll talk to the local ministry leader or pastor oftentimes about what their customs are about doing ministry. Because our church, we like to pray for one another, we like to minister to one another, and we like to bless and speak blessing and connect with one another. And there's so many places they said, well, we don't really do that very much. I said, well, would you mind if I do that at the close of the conference? And they generally would say, well, yeah, that's fine, but don't expect a lot of people would come or whatever. But I almost every time we do it, half or the whole room comes forward. Isn't it interesting? And I think sometimes we just think that we know more than we know. When you admit what you don't know, it actually leaves room for faith. Now back to this chapter, there's an interesting thing that is said at verse 4 that tells us something about what's happening here. It says, and he had to pass through Samaria. Well, it's a very interesting thing because what it literally says in the Greek is it was necessary. Well, it wasn't necessary. We just looked at the map earlier. He could have gone around a longer route. So at the simplest level, it might be if you want to take a direct route, you have to pass through Samaria. But this phrase, it is necessary, it is used often in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Luke, like when Jesus says it is necessary that the Son of Man shall suffer many things at the hands of the chief priests and the scribes. It's necessary. So you start getting a sense that there's some sort of divine appointment that is going on here. And in the whole conversation, you're wondering all along the way, what does Jesus know? Here's an interesting question, which you could end up spending a whole day thinking about it. It probably just needs to go in what Pastor Chris calls the mystery bucket, where I don't know the answer to it. But did Jesus, he is fully God and fully man, did he know everything? Well, the answer is no, he didn't know everything. Matthew 24:36 says, concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven or the Son. Talking about the return of Christ, Christ said, I don't even know the time. So there's at least one thing he didn't know. Interesting, in Mark 5, remember the story of the woman with the hemorrhage that touched his garment and then was healed? It's interesting, Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched my garments?" And it seems like he's genuinely asking, who was it? Maybe he didn't know who had touched him. Luke 2:52 says Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. These are interesting things. And there's a sense in which, on the other hand, you say Jesus lived fully human and fully God, but at times he restrained his divinity, even though he could have exercised it, like when he was tempted in the wilderness by the devil to turn the stones into bread or to fling himself off a high place and let the angels take care of him, and he said no. He was restraining from being only divine so that he could experience what it's like to be human. And anyway, Jesus is having a very human interaction. He's thirsty at a natural level. He asks her for water, and she then begins this conversation. How much does Jesus know about what's going to happen? How does he know about what's going to happen with this woman? I don't really know. But it reads, if you read this whole chapter, it reads almost like Jesus knew that there was possibility for this woman. And he was maybe following his Father. He said, "I'll only do what I see my Father doing." Just following her every step through the conversation. And maybe it's unfolding. I'm not sure. There's so much that she doesn't know. And that becomes the center of the story at verse 10. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would give you living water." He turns the story back now to say, this is a much story about what you don't yet know, and if you did. You ever wonder what Jesus was thinking and feeling in all these interactions with people? I can try and imagine, and here's a scenario I think of. Imagine you're a physician, modern day physician, and somehow you get a time travel machine and you go back 200 years. And you're meeting with a physician back from 1800. Back in the days in which they didn't have any germ theory, and they thought it was a good thing to put leeches on people or to cut them and let them bleed when they were sick. They killed people bleeding them because they thought somebody was going to let the bad blood out. I mean, just a couple hundred years ago, medical care was just preposterous. But imagine you were a physician today, having been trained in excellent medical school, and you went back 200 years, and you're meeting with a physician, and you're seeing a patient with the physician in 1800, and he says, "Well, hand me the scalpel, and we'll start the blood." And you're the physician who knows, what's going on is a simple infection. It needs an antibiotic. Can you imagine yourself in that position? You might say, if you knew how much I know, you would not ask me for a scalpel to bleed your patient. You would ask me for my medical books. You would ask me for germ theory. You would ask me what an antibiotic is. You see, you can be in a situation in life you don't know enough to even know what you need to ask. And I think that people, when Jesus meets them, he is feeling this way, like he loves them so much. He just longs for them to have what he has, to know what he knows, to live the life of the Spirit that he lives. And people don't know. He's so gracious. You can just imagine what it's like. He was the source of life. He is the one who knows the work that he's going to do on the cross that's going to pay for her sins. He is going to do all of that. And he just says to her, "If you'd known, you'd ask me for living water." And she says at verse 15, "Sir, give me this water so I'll not be thirsty." And Jesus then reveals he knows a lot about her. And again, whether he knew all this going into it or the Father's just showing him as he goes, I'm not sure. But this is where he says, "Go call your husband," verse 16, "and come here." And the woman says, "I have no husband." He said, "You're right in saying I have no husband. You've had 5 husbands. The one you have now is not your husband. What you've said is true." And she says to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." We know that however this interaction is taking place, that she's not feeling shame from Jesus, because what she does is she in her excitement, even though her checkered past has been revealed, in her excitement, she goes and she tells all of her friends, I think this is the Messiah. Verse 28, so the woman left her water jar, went into town, and said to the people, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out of town and were coming to him. And that's where Jesus says to the disciples, verse 35 and following, do you not say there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? That usually between the time you plant the seeds and you get your harvest, there's 4 months. There was some sort of saying probably in that day. Do you not know that? And he quotes that and he says, look. I think literally saying, pick up your eyes and look, because Samaritans were starting to come towards them. And he's basically saying the harvest is at hand. I want you, Jesus says, to quit deciding in your heart who it is that's going to be saved and who's not. I want you to change your way of thinking about who might be transformed and who might not be. You know, over the course of my Christian life and ministry, I have come to this conclusion, that when I think that I know who it is that's going to be responsive to the love of God and have their life changed, and who is not going to, if I think that I really know, I'm just found invariably I'm basically usually wrong. So I'm just getting to the point that I quit trying and just wonder, maybe this person's going to receive. You never know. About 6 years ago, our congregation had opportunity to meet a dear woman named Hilda. Hilda grew up in an abusive home, both her mom and dad alcoholic. She witnessed her father cut her mother. She was taken to live with her grandfather, who was also an alcoholic. She experienced abuse and molestation throughout her life. As she became a young woman, she became addicted to pain medications, and she had checkered relationships. She had a daughter, and she was introduced to the prison system after she tried to claim sole right to her daughter and had a physical assault against the daughter's father. She was taken to prison. She was initially given a 5-year sentence. When she was in prison, she realized that she had to harden herself even more, and she became, by her own testimony, the meanest inmate there. She fought with the other women regularly, and she, for various reasons, had continued trouble, so that her time in jail went on, and this was her life while she was in jail. The first time she met a heroin supplier who, after she got out the first time, became her supplier. She went back to jail after that numerous times, moved from one to the next until she wound up in Coleman, Alabama. And there's a church there led by a very, very precious pastor named Bobby Hill. And they were leading Bible studies using materials that I'd written called Shame Off You. And they said that Hilda came around and sneered at the group, and then she eventually came and sat on the back edge of the group. And Hilda said later, these people loved as genuinely as I'd ever seen anybody love. Eventually she came up into the actual circle. And she said that they came to the session on a chapter called For the Want of a Mom and a Dad. And she said she left and she cried and she cried and she cried out to God and said, if you're really there, I want to know you, but it can't be like the hurtful religion that I've had before. It's got to be different this time, God. And she said, I just almost cried myself to sleep. And she said she woke up the next morning and she was at the ladies' room, and one of the other inmates looked at her and said, what's happened to you? And Hilda said, what? And the lady said, you're smiling. And she looked in the mirror and she said she was smiling. And that day she opened her Bible and she read a scripture, "My peace I give you, not as the world gives you." I get emotional when I tell the story because Hilda became a friend. And she garnered so much favor with prison authorities that they let her come and visit and meet me at a conference that we were doing one time in Alabama. She devoured those materials and became a leader of shame off you groups in the Coleman, Alabama jail. And she led many of them and led many women to freedom. You never know. This woman that Jesus met was the least likely woman in all the world that he'd have a conversation with, much less be the one that would be the start of a revival. And that's what happened, because what happened was the Samaritans from that town at verse 39, it said many of them believed in him because of the woman's testimony. And so when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And verse 41 says, and many more believed because of his word. What do I take away from all of this is to say simply this, that the limits of our knowledge is not bad news, it's good news, because what it does is it makes us open up our heart to say to Jesus, I don't know, I need your eyes. And it makes us aware of this astounding good news. If Jesus would interact with a Samaritan woman who was despised like that, a woman with such a checkered past, a woman that was unlike he'd even speak to, and he would love her and speak to her that way, does this not assure us that Christ himself has come to us in the same way? And what it means is that the prerequisite of our life is not that we have everything together, but that we come thirsty. As Isaiah prophesied, is anyone thirsty? Come and drink. Even if you have no money, come take your choice of wine or milk. It's all free. Jesus began his ministry at Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. John 7:37, on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. And the Bible ends in its final chapter with the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let the one who hears say, come, and let the one who is thirsty come, let the one who desires take the water of life without price. Is anyone thirsty? In other words, Jesus knows how little you and I know, and he says, are you thirsty to know the truth? Are you thirsty for the love of God? It is our only real prerequisite, is that we come to him knowing how much we need him. He knew he was going to die for our sins, for that woman's sins. He knew the Holy Spirit is the giver of a life, and he wanted her to have it. And that's what mattered to him. And he wants you and I to live in that abundance as well. You never know. And that's the gospel.